In the harsh mountains of rural Appalachia, where ancient traditions run deeper than the coal veins beneath the earth, a mother's love would be tested beyond imagination. When the village elders declared her child cursed and demanded exile, Sarah Morgan had nowhere to turn. But sometimes, protection comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, a stranger's promise can change everything. This is the story of a woman who refused to abandon her child, a community that forgot its humanity, and a hunter who remembered what honor truly meant. The morning mist clung to the mountains like a shroud. When Sarah Morgan first realized her world was about to crumble, she sat in the old wooden chair by her kitchen window, watching the sun struggle to break through the gray clouds that seemed to mirror the heaviness in her heart. In her arms, little Emma slept peacefully, unaware that the village she had been born into just 6 months ago was already turning against her. Emma had been born different. Her left leg was twisted, shorter than the right, and her foot turned inward in a way that made the midwife cross herself and whisper prayers. The doctor from the county seat had used big words that Sarah didn't fully understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Her daughter would never walk normally, never run through the meadows like other children, never dance at the harvest festivals that marked the turning of the seasons in their small mountain community. Sarah had been 18 when she married Thomas Morgan, and 19 when he died in the mine collapse that took 7 good men from their village. She had been carrying Emma then, her belly round with promise and hope. Thomas had been so excited about becoming a father, talking endlessly about teaching his child to fish in the creek, to track deer through the forest, to know every path and hollow in the mountains that had been home to the Morgan family for 5 generations. But Thomas was gone now, buried in the little cemetery behind the white clapboard church, and Sarah was left to raise their daughter alone. She had thought the community would help her, the way mountain people always help their own. For a while they had. Neighbor women brought casseroles and offers to help with the baby. The men from the mine had passed the hat to help with expenses. Sarah had felt held up by the invisible threads that bound their small world together. Everything changed the day Elder Hutchins came to visit. Sarah remembered that afternoon with perfect clarity. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind her small cabin when she saw the black sedan making its way up the dirt road. Cars like that didn't often come to their part of the mountain. Most folks drove pickup trucks or older sedans that could handle the rough terrain. This car was different, expensive looking, and it moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who brought serious business. Elder Hutchins stepped out of the car like a man accustomed to respect. He was tall and thin, with silver hair combed straight back and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore a black suit despite the heat, and his shoes were polished to a shine that seemed almost aggressive in their mountain world of worn boots and practical clothing. Sarah had never seen him before, but she knew who he was. Everyone in the mountain communities knew about the Council of Elders, the group of men who settled disputes and made decisions that affected all the scattered families in the region. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I need to speak with you about your child." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She wiped her hands on her apron and tried to keep her voice steady. "What about Emma?" Elder Hutchins looked toward the cabin where Emma was napping in her crib. "The community has concerns. The child was born afflicted. There are those who believe this is a sign." "A sign of what?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Of God's displeasure. Of sin that has not been properly confessed or atoned for." Elder Hutchins folded his hands behind his back and studied Sarah with those cold eyes. "The old ways teach us that when a child is born marked by deformity, it reflects the spiritual condition of the parents. Your husband died before he could see his child. Perhaps there were things he needed to confess. Perhaps there are things you need to confess." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest like a flame catching kindling. My Thomas was a good man. He never hurt anyone. He worked hard, he loved his family, and he died trying to save the other miners when the tunnel collapsed. And Emma is an innocent baby. Whatever you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting, Mrs. East. Morgan. I'm telling you how things stand. Elder Hutchins stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the funeral home in town. "The community has been patient. They have tried to help you because of your husband's memory. But patience has its limits." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the presence of a cursed child in our midst is a threat to everyone. Bad luck spreads like disease. Crop failures, mine accidents, sickness, death. These things follow in the wake of God's judgment. The other families have children too. They have a right to protect them." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're talking about my baby daughter." "She's just a baby. She hasn't hurt anyone. The child is marked," Elder Hutchins said with finality. "And marks like that don't fade. They grow stronger with time. The community has made its decision. You have 1 week to make arrangements. Arrangements for what? To leave. Both of you. Find somewhere else to raise the child. Somewhere far enough away that her curse can't touch the good people here. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the clothesline post. This is my home. Thomas's family has lived here for generations. You can't just... The council can do whatever is necessary to protect the community, Elder Hutchins interrupted. 1 week, Mrs. Morgan. Use it wisely. He turned and walked back to his car without another word, leaving Sarah standing in her backyard, with wet laundry hanging around her like surrender flags. She watched the black sedan disappear down the mountain road, carrying with it everything she had thought she understood about her place in the world. The next few days passed in a blur of disbelief and growing panic. Sarah tried to reach out to the people she had thought were her friends and neighbors. She visited the Hendersons, who lived just down the hollow. Mrs. Henderson had been kind after Thomas's death, bringing soup and staying to help with the baby. But when Sarah knocked on her door, Mrs. Henderson barely opened it a crack. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "But we've got our own children to think about. The council knows what's best." The same scene played out everywhere Sarah went. People who had known her since she was a girl suddenly couldn't meet her gaze. Doors that had always been open to her remained closed, even at the general store. Mr. Patterson served her quickly and quietly, taking her money without the usual friendly conversation about weather and crops and local gossip. Sarah began to understand that Elder Hutchins hadn't been making threats. He had been delivering news of a decision already made. The community had chosen to believe that her innocent daughter was somehow responsible for their troubles, and they wanted both of them gone. On the 4th day, Sarah walked to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. The headstone was simple grey granite with his name, dates, and the words "beloved husband and father." She sat down in the grass beside the grave and talked to him the way she had when he was alive, telling him about their days, sharing her worries and hopes. "I don't know what to do, Thomas," she whispered, tears making her voice thick. "They want us to leave, but where would we go? I don't have any money saved, and Emma needs medical care for her leg. The doctor in town said there might be surgeries that could help when she gets older, but that costs money we don't have. If we leave here, leave everything we know, how am I supposed to take care of her?" The wind rustled through the pine trees that surrounded the cemetery, and for a moment Sarah imagined she could hear Thomas's voice in that sound, telling her to be strong, to fight for their daughter. But strength and fighting spirit couldn't change the reality of her situation. She was a 19-year-old widow with no education beyond high school, no job skills beyond keeping house and tending a garden. She had a disabled child who would need more care and more money than most families could provide, and now she was being cast out from the only community she had ever known. That night, Sarah sat up late in her kitchen, making lists and trying to figure out some kind of plan. She had maybe $300 in the coffee can where she kept her emergency money. The cabin belonged to the mining company, so she couldn't sell it. Her old Honda barely ran on a good day. How was she supposed to pack up her entire life and start over somewhere else with so little to work with? Emma woke up around midnight, fussing and hungry. Sarah heated a bottle and sat in the rocking chair that had been her mother-in-law's, feeding her daughter and trying not to think about all the uncertainties ahead of them. Emma's eyes were already changing from the blue all babies are born with to the warm brown of her father's eyes. She had his chin too, and the way she gripped Sarah's finger reminded Sarah so much of Thomas that it made her chest ache. "What are we going to do, sweet girl?" Sarah whispered into the quiet darkness. "How are we going to make it on our own?" Emma just looked up at her with those trusting eyes, completely unaware of the danger they were in. She didn't know that the place she had been born was rejecting her, that the people who should have been her extended family had decided she was cursed and unwanted. She was just a baby who needed her mother, and Sarah was determined to be everything Emma needed, even if she had no idea how. The 5th day brought rain, the kind of steady mountain rain that seemed to seep into everything and make the whole world grey and cold. Sarah spent the morning going through her belongings, trying to decide what she could fit in her car and what she would have to leave behind. Thomas's clothes still hung in the closet, and touching them made her feel like she was losing him all over again. But there wasn't room for sentiment now. She needed to be practical. She was packing Emma's things when she heard the truck coming up the road. The engine sound was different from Elder Hutchins' car, rougher and more familiar. Sarah looked out the window and saw Jack Henderson's pickup truck, the one with the dented tailgate and the gun rack in the back window. For a moment, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe someone was finally going to help. But when Jack got out of the truck, he wasn't alone. 3 other men climbed out with him. Men Sarah recognized from church and the general store. They walked toward her cabin with the slow, determined stride of people who had come to finish an unpleasant job. Sarah met them at the front door, holding Emma in her arms. The baby was awake and alert, looking around with the curiosity that was starting to replace the sleepy newborn fog. "Sarah," Jack said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "We came to help you pack." "The week isn't up yet," Sarah said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Close enough," said Pete Morrison, the man who ran the gas station. "And the sooner you're gone, the better for everyone." "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not our problem," said the third man, whose name Sarah couldn't remember, but whose face she had known her whole life. "We're just here to make sure you understand that you need to be gone by tomorrow morning." Sarah looked at these men, searching their faces for any sign of the compassion she had once believed defined their community. But all she saw was impatience and the cold determination of people who had convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. "And if I'm not?" Jack Henderson looked uncomfortable, but his voice stayed steady. "Then we'll have to make you leave. And that won't be pleasant for anyone, especially not for the baby." The threat was clear, even though it was delivered in the polite, indirect way that mountain people used when they wanted to avoid saying ugly things directly. Sarah clutched Emma closer and felt the last of her illusions about her community crumble away completely. "Fine," she said. "I'll be gone in the morning." The men nodded and turned to leave, but Jack Henderson paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "For what it's worth, Sarah, I'm sorry it came to this, but the council knows what's best for everyone. You'll see. Once you're away from here, maybe the curse will lift and things will get better for everyone." He climbed back into his truck, and Sarah watched the 4 men drive away, leaving her alone with her daughter and the impossible task of starting over with nothing. She closed the door and locked it, though she knew locks wouldn't keep out the kind of danger she was really facing. That night, as Sarah continued packing by lamplight, she heard something that made her freeze with terror. Voices outside, men's voices talking low and urgent. She crept to the window and peered through the curtain. In the darkness, she could see the glow of cigarettes and the shapes of several men standing at the edge of her yard. They were watching her house, making sure she didn't try to run away in the middle of the night, or maybe just making sure she understood that she was completely alone now. Sarah pulled the curtain closed and checked all the locks again, her heart hammering against her ribs. She spent the rest of the night packing and checking on Emma, who slept peacefully through the crisis surrounding her. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sarah loaded her car with everything she could fit. It wasn't much. Some clothes, a few precious photographs, Emma's things, and the coffee can with her small savings. Everything else, all the furniture and dishes and mementos that had made the cabin feel like home, would stay behind. Sarah strapped Emma's car seat into the back of her Honda and took one last look at the cabin where she had been happy, where she had expected to raise her daughter surrounded by community and love. Then she got in the car, started the engine that coughed and wheezed in protest, and drove away from the only home she had ever known. She didn't look back. The Honda made it exactly 17 miles before it gave up completely. Sarah had been nursing it along the winding mountain roads, feeling the engine shudder and miss with increasing frequency, when it finally shuddered one last time and died. She managed to guide it to the shoulder of the narrow highway before it stopped rolling entirely. Sarah sat in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal and Emma's soft breathing from the back seat. Through the windshield, she could see nothing but trees and mountains stretching endlessly in all directions. The morning sun was climbing higher, promising another hot day, and she had no idea where she was or what she was going to do next. She tried turning the key again, pumping the gas pedal the way Thomas had taught her, but the engine didn't even turn over. The Honda was 15 years old and had been running on prayers and determination for the last 2 years. Sarah had known this day would come eventually, but she had hoped it would wait until she could afford to fix it or replace it. Emma started to fuss, the way babies do when they sense their mother's distress. Sarah got out of the car and opened the back door, unbuckling Emma from her car seat and lifting her out. The baby needed changing, and probably feeding, but Sarah had no idea how to manage any of that on the side of a mountain highway with no help and nowhere to go. She was standing there holding Emma and trying not to panic when she heard the rumble of an approaching truck. Sarah turned to see a battered pickup coming around the curve, moving slowly as if the driver was being careful on the narrow road. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe someone would stop and help. Maybe this was the beginning of the luck changing that she desperately needed. The truck slowed as it approached. and Sarah could see the driver looking at her broken-down car and her standing there with a baby in her arms. The truck was old and weathered, painted a faded green that spoke of years of hard use. It had the kind of practical modifications that working people made to their vehicles. A heavy-duty bumper, a toolbox in the bed, and what looked like hunting equipment secured under a tarp. The truck pulled over and stopped behind her car. The driver sat for a moment, engine idling, as if he was making a decision. Then the engine shut off and the door opened. The man who got out was not what Sarah had expected. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were practical work clothes, worn jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing arms that were tanned and scarred from outdoor work. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. But there was something careful about the way he approached, as if he was aware that a man appearing suddenly on a lonely road might frighten a woman alone with a baby. "Car trouble?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice was deep and quiet, with the mountain accent that Sarah recognized as home.
"It just died,"
Sarah said, shifting Emma to her other arm. The baby was getting heavier, and Sarah's arms were starting to ache. "I don't know anything about cars." The man nodded and walked over to a Honda, lifting the hood without asking permission. He spent several minutes looking at the engine, touching various parts and making small, thoughtful sounds. Finally, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. "It's the transmission," he said. "Probably been slipping for a while, making grinding noises when you shifted." Sarah nodded. She had noticed those sounds but had been hoping they would just go away on their own. "I'm afraid it's gone completely now. This car isn't going anywhere without major work, and even then it might not be worth fixing."
He looked at Sarah with what might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry."
That's not what you wanted to hear. Sarah felt tears starting to burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. "Is there a town nearby? Somewhere I could call someone?" The man studied her for a moment, taking in her obviously packed car, her young face, and the baby in her arms. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "There's a small town about 5 miles down the road, Pine Ridge. But I have to ask, are you running from something? Because if you're in some kind of danger—" "No," Sarah said quickly, then reconsidered. Maybe she was running from danger, just not the kind he was probably thinking about. "I'm not in immediate danger. I'm just between places right now, trying to get somewhere new to start over." The man nodded as if he understood more than she had actually said. "My name's Marcus Webb. I live up in these mountains and I know this area pretty well. Pine Ridge has a mechanic, but he's not very good and he charges too much. More importantly, it doesn't have much in the way of opportunities for someone looking to start over." "I don't have much choice at this point," Sarah said, bouncing Emma gently as the baby started to fuss again. "I need to get somewhere, and this is where my car decided to stop working." Marcus Webb looked at her car again, then at the mountains around them, as if he was calculating something. "Look, I know this is going to sound strange coming from someone you just met, but I've got a suggestion. There's a cabin about 10 miles up the mountain from here. It belongs to my family, but nobody's been using it. It's not fancy, but it's got running water and electricity, and it's furnished with the basics. If you need somewhere to stay while you figure out your next move, you could use it for a while." Sarah stared at him in surprise. After the past week of having doors slammed in her face and being told she wasn't welcome anywhere, the offer of help felt almost too good to be true. "I can't pay much for rent," she said carefully. "I wasn't thinking about rent. I was thinking about someone helping to keep an eye on the place. My grandfather built that cabin back in the 60s, and my family has been using it as a hunting lodge and retreat ever since. But it's been sitting empty for the past year, and empty cabins in the mountains have a way of attracting problems. Animals, vandals, squatters. If someone was living there, keeping it clean and maintained, that would actually be helping me out." Sarah felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Why would you help a stranger? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains that surrounded them. "I guess because everyone needs help sometimes and most people don't get enough of it." He turned back to her. "Besides, you've got a baby. Whatever situation brought you out here on your own, that baby didn't have anything to do with it. She deserves a safe place to sleep and grow up." Emma chose that moment to start crying in earnest, the kind of wailing that meant she was getting hungry and uncomfortable, and had reached the limit of her patience with being held on the side of a road. Sarah started the automatic bouncing and swaying that mothers do, but it wasn't helping much. "She needs feeding and changing," Sarah said, raising her voice over Emma's cries. "But I don't know how to manage that here." "The cabin's not far," Marcus said. "If you want to see it, I can give you and your things a ride up there. You can take care of the baby, see if the place suits you, and then decide what you want to do. Sarah looked at this stranger who was offering her exactly what she needed most: shelter and time to figure out her next move. Every instinct told her to be careful, that accepting help from a man she didn't know could be dangerous. But every practical consideration told her she didn't have any better options. She was stranded on a mountain road with a crying baby. No money for a hotel even if there was one nearby, and no one in the world she could call for help. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you. I'd like to see the cabin." Marcus nodded and went to work transferring her belongings from the Honda to his truck. He handled her things carefully, as if he understood that everything she owned was now packed into those few bags and boxes. When he was finished, he helped her get Emma's car seat secured in his truck, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who was used to solving practical problems. The ride up the mountain took them on roads that got progressively narrower and rougher. Marcus drove slowly and carefully, clearly familiar with every curve and pothole. He didn't try to make conversation over Emma's continued crying, which Sarah appreciated. She was feeling overwhelmed and fragile, and small talk would have been more than she could handle. "How do you know these roads so well?" Sarah finally asked as they navigated a particularly tricky switchback. "I grew up here," Marcus said simply. "My family's had land in these mountains for 4 generations. I know every trail and creek within 50 miles. What do you do for work?" "I'm a hunting guide. I take people out who want to hunt deer, bear, wild turkey. I also do some tracking work for the Forest Service, and I help out with search and rescue when they need someone who knows the backcountry." He glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "It's not steady work, but it pays the bills and lets me live the way I want to live." They turned onto an even smaller road, really just 2 tracks with grass growing between them, and started climbing more steeply. Through the trees, Sarah could see glimpses of valleys and distant ridges, the kind of views that reminded you just how big and wild these mountains really were. "Are we going to be completely isolated up here?" Sarah asked, suddenly wondering if accepting this ride had been a mistake. "Not completely. There are a few other cabins scattered around these hills, though most of them are only used seasonally. And the main road is just 10 miles down the mountain."
"But yes, it's pretty remote."
Marcus looked at her again, and his expression was serious. "If that makes you uncomfortable, I can turn around right now and take you back to Pine Ridge."
"I don't want you to feel trapped or unsafe." Sarah considered this. Remote meant isolated, but it also meant private. It meant no neighbors to judge her or make demands. It meant Emma could grow up without people staring at her leg or whispering about curses. Maybe remote was exactly what they needed. "Let's see the cabin first," she said. They crested a small rise, and suddenly the cabin came into view. Sarah's first thought was that it looked like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales were set in Appalachian mountains instead of European forests. The cabin was built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, with a green metal roof and a wide front porch that looked out over a small clearing. Garden beds along the front of the cabin were overgrown with wildflowers and herbs that had gone wild, creating splashes of color against the backdrop of forest green. Marcus parked the truck near the front steps and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, Emma's crying seemed even louder. But underneath it, Sarah could hear the sounds of the forest, birds calling and wind moving through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of running water. "Creek's just through those trees," Marcus said, noticing her listening. "Good, clean mountain water. The cabin has indoor plumbing, but the creek's handy for other things." He got out and came around to help Sarah with Emma's car seat. The baby was red-faced and furious now, having reached the stage of hunger and discomfort where only immediate attention would help. "You should take care of her first," Marcus said. "The tour can wait." Sarah nodded gratefully and followed him up the steps to the front porch. The door was solid wood with a simple lock, and Marcus produced a key from his pocket. "I'll give you this," he said, handing her the key. "There's a spare hidden under the flower pot by the steps, but you might want to move it somewhere else if you decide to stay." The inside of the cabin was simple but comfortable. The front door opened directly into a main room that served as living room and kitchen, with a stone fireplace on one wall and windows that looked out into the forest. The furniture was sturdy and practical, the kind of pieces built to last for decades. A short hallway led to 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom that, while basic, had all the necessities. Sarah carried Emma into the larger bedroom and laid her on the bed to change her diaper. The baby's cries subsided to hiccuping sobs as Sarah cleaned her up and got her into dry clothes. The relief of handling this familiar task in a safe, private space was enormous. "Better?" Marcus asked when Sarah emerged from the bedroom with a much calmer baby. "Much better, thank you." Sarah looked around the cabin again, trying to imagine what it would be like to live here. It's beautiful, but are you sure about this? You really don't know anything about me. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter and considered her question. I know you're a young mother who got forced out of her home community for some reason. I know you're broke and alone and trying to figure out how to take care of your baby. I know you're scared, but you're not giving up. He paused. And I know that baby has something wrong with her leg, and I'm guessing that had something to do with why you left where you came from. Sarah felt her face go hot with embarrassment and anger. How did you? I notice things. It's part of my job. And I've seen that look before. The look people get when they're running from ignorance and superstition instead of real danger. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. There are still people in these mountains who think birth defects are signs of God's judgment or evidence of sin. It's an ugly kind of thinking, but it's not uncommon. Sarah felt tears starting again, but this time they were tears of relief at being understood rather than tears of despair. They said she was cursed. They said keeping her in the community would bring bad luck to everyone else. That's exactly the kind of ignorant nonsense I was talking about. Marcus straightened up from the counter, and there was anger in his voice now, though Sarah sensed it wasn't directed at her. Your daughter isn't cursed. She's a baby with a physical condition that can probably be helped with proper medical care. The people who drove you out are the ones with the real problem. Emma had finished her bottle and was starting to look drowsy in the warm afternoon sunlight that streamed through the cabin windows. Sarah felt some of the tension that had been knotting her shoulders for the past week begin to loosen. If I stayed here, she said carefully, what would the arrangements be? I mean, what would you expect from me? Just what I said. Keep the place clean, make sure nobody breaks in or causes damage, maybe keep an eye on the other cabins in the area during hunting season. In return, you'd have a place to live rent-free for as long as you need it. Marcus paused. I should probably mention that I live about 2 miles from here, in a cabin my grandfather built for the family to use year-round. So you wouldn't be completely alone up here, but you'd have your privacy. Sarah walked to one of the windows and looked out at the forest that surrounded the cabin. She could see a garden area that had once been cultivated but was now growing wild, and beyond that, trails that disappeared into the trees. It was beautiful and peaceful, in a way that felt like a balm after the hostility and fear of the past week. There's one more thing, Marcus said, and something in his tone made Sarah turn around. The people who drove you out, do you think they'll come looking for you? Try to make more trouble? Sarah hadn't considered this possibility, and the thought made her stomach clench with fresh anxiety. I don't know. Maybe. Elder Hutchins, the man who told me to leave, he seemed pretty determined that Emma and I should be gone from the area completely. Well, if anyone comes around here causing problems, they'll have to deal with me. Marcus's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. I don't have much patience for bullies, especially bullies who pick on women and children. Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Not just safety, but the feeling of being protected. Having someone on her side who wasn't afraid of the people who had power over her old community. Why? She asked. Why are you doing this for us? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the mountains. My little sister was born with a cleft palate, he said finally. Not as visible as your daughter's condition, but noticeable. And I remember how some people in our community treated her. The things they said, the way they looked at her like she was something to be ashamed of. His jaw tightened. I was too young then to do anything about it, but I'm not too young now. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. Here was someone who understood, someone who had seen the ugly side of the superstition and ignorance that had driven her from her home. Your sister, is she?
She's fine.
Married now, with kids of her own. Lives down in Tennessee where people are a little more enlightened about these things. Marcus turned back to Sarah. The point is, every child deserves a chance to grow up without being told they're cursed or broken. Your daughter deserves that chance. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her face relaxed and beautiful in the way only sleeping babies could be. For the first time since Elder Hutchins had delivered his ultimatum, Sarah felt like maybe they were going to be okay. I'd like to stay, she said. If the offer is really open. It's open, Marcus said. Welcome to the mountain, Sarah. I hope you and Emma find some peace here. As Marcus helped her bring the rest of her things in from the truck, Sarah began to think that maybe they would. For the first time in days, the future didn't look completely dark and impossible. Maybe being cast out from her old life was going to turn out to be the beginning of something better. She had no way of knowing that the hardest challenges were still ahead of them. The first month at the cabin passed like a dream. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to wake up without fear, to go through her days without watching over her shoulder for signs of judgment or rejection. Emma seemed to sense the change in her mother's mood and became a happier, more content baby. She slept better, cried less, and began to reach those developmental milestones that all mothers watch for with eager anticipation. Sarah established routines that gave shape and meaning to their days. Mornings were for household tasks and caring for Emma. Afternoons were for exploring their new environment, taking walks around the cabin property and discovering the network of trails that crisscross the mountain. Evenings were peaceful times by the fireplace, reading or simply enjoying the silence that came when civilization was far enough away that you couldn't hear its constant hum. Marcus had been true to his word about respecting their privacy.
He checked on them twice during that first month, both times calling out from the edge of the clearing before approaching the cabin. The first visit was to bring supplies he thought they might need: basic groceries, firewood, and a battery-powered radio so Sarah could stay connected to news and weather reports.
The second visit was to fix a loose board on the front porch steps and to show Sarah where the electrical panel and water shutoff valve were located, practical information she needed to manage the cabin properly. Both times, he was polite and helpful but kept his visits short, clearly understanding that Sarah needed time and space to adjust to her new circumstances. He played briefly with Emma, who seemed to find his deep voice and gentle manner soothing, but he didn't push for more interaction than Sarah was comfortable with. It was during the 5th week that Sarah first saw the black sedan. She was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between 2 trees behind the cabin when she heard the unfamiliar sound of a car engine laboring up the mountain road. Her heart immediately started racing, because in all the time she had been at the cabin, the only vehicle she had seen was Marcus's pickup truck. This engine sounded different, more refined, but struggling with the rough terrain. Sarah quickly gathered Emma from her blanket on the grass and hurried to the front window of the cabin, where she could see the road. Through the trees she caught glimpses of black paint and chrome, and her stomach dropped with recognition. Elder Hutchins had found her. The sedan pulled into the clearing and stopped near where Marcus's truck usually parked when he visited. Sarah watched from behind the curtain as Elder Hutchins got out of the car, looking around the cabin and forest with the expression of a man who found himself in an alien environment. He was still dressed in his formal black suit, which looked completely out of place in the mountain setting. He wasn't alone. Jack Henderson emerged from the passenger side, followed by 2 other men from the back seat. Sarah recognized them as members of the Council of Elders, though she didn't know their names. All 4 men looked serious and determined, and Sarah felt her brief period of peace and safety crumbling around her. Elder Hutchins walked up to the front door and knocked, the sound sharp and commanding in the mountain quiet. Sarah stayed back from the window, holding Emma close and trying to think. She could pretend not to be home, but her laundry was hanging on the line, and there were other signs of recent occupancy that would be obvious to anyone looking. She could try to slip out the back door and hide in the forest, but she would have to take Emma with her, and babies weren't good at staying quiet when they needed to. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Morgan," Elder Hutchins called out. "We know you're in there. We need to speak with you." Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting these men control her life through fear and intimidation. She walked to the front door and opened it, but she didn't step outside or invite them in. "Elder Hutchins," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "What are you doing here?" "I think that's obvious, Mrs. Morgan. We've come to bring you home." "This is my home now," Sarah said firmly. "You made it very clear that Emma and I weren't welcome in your community." "The community has reconsidered," Elder Hutchins said, though his expression suggested that he personally disagreed with this reconsideration. "There have been some developments that have caused us to reevaluate our previous decision." Sarah felt a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach.
What kind of developments?
Jack Henderson stepped forward, his face uncomfortable but determined. "There's been trouble since you left, Sarah. The carpenter boy fell down an old mine shaft and broke both his legs. The Hendersons' wheat crop failed completely, even though the weather's been perfect. Mrs. K. Patterson had a miscarriage, and Doc Baker says there was no medical reason for it." "And you think these things are connected to me somehow?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand where this conversation was headed. "We think they're connected to the curse," Elder Hutchins said bluntly. "We thought that removing the cursed child from our community would end the troubles. Instead, they seem to have gotten worse. The council has concluded that the curse cannot be lifted by simply sending you away. More active measures are required." Sarah's grip on Emma tightened. "What do you mean by active measures?" The child must be dealt with properly, Elder Hutchins said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a religious pronouncement. The community cannot heal while the curse remains. Since distance hasn't been effective, more direct action is necessary. The meaning of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't talking about exile anymore. They were talking about something much worse. "You're talking about hurting my baby," she said, her voice rising with panic and anger. "You're talking about harming an innocent child because you think she's responsible for accidents and bad luck." "I'm talking about protecting the greater good," Elder Hutchins replied coldly. "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. One cursed child cannot be allowed to bring destruction to an entire community." Sarah started to back away from the door, but Elder Hutchins stepped forward, and she realized with growing terror that he meant to come inside whether she invited him or not. "You're not taking my daughter," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "I won't let you hurt her. You don't have a choice in this matter, Mrs. Crawford." Morgan. "The council has made its decision." Elder Hutchins reached for the door, clearly intending to push his way into the cabin, when a new voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." All 5 people turned to see Marcus Webb standing at the edge of the clearing. He must have approached through the forest because none of them had heard him coming. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, but there was something different about his posture, something alert and dangerous that hadn't been there during his previous friendly visits. "This is a private matter," Elder Hutchins said, drawing himself up to his full height in an attempt to project authority. "It doesn't concern you." "Anything that happens on my property concerns me," Marcus replied, walking slowly toward the cabin. "And anything that involves threatening a woman and a baby definitely concerns me." "Your property?" Jack Henderson looked confused. "We were told this cabin was abandoned." "You were told wrong. This is Webb family land. Has been for 60 years. Mrs. Carha, Morgan is my guest, and she's under my protection." Marcus stopped about 10 feet from the group of men, close enough to intervene quickly, but far enough away to avoid seeming immediately threatening. "Now, I'm going to ask you once politely to get off my land and leave these people alone." Elder Hutchins studied Marcus with cold calculation. "I don't know who you are, young man, but you're interfering in matters you don't understand. This woman's child is cursed, and that curse is bringing harm to our community. We have a responsibility to deal with the situation. The only thing I see that needs dealing with is 4 grown men threatening a teenage mother and her baby," Marcus said. His voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up, and that's something I take very seriously. "We have the authority of the council behind us," Elder Hutchins said. "We represent the will of the community." "I don't care if you represent the will of God himself," Marcus replied. "You're not taking that child anywhere, and if you try, you're going to have to go through me first." The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut. Sarah could see the men from her old community weighing their options, trying to decide if this was a confrontation they wanted to pursue. Marcus looked relaxed, but Sarah could sense the coiled energy in his stance, like a predator ready to spring. Elder Hutchins seemed to come to a decision. "Mr. Webb, isn't it? I think you should know what you're protecting. This child was born deformed, marked by God's judgment on her parents' sins. Since her birth, our community has suffered a series of misfortunes that can only be explained as the workings of a curse. We're not monsters, Mr. Croyer, Webb. We're people trying to protect our families and our way of life, and I'm a man trying to protect an innocent woman and her baby from a bunch of superstitious bullies," Marcus replied. "Seems pretty clear which side of that equation is right. You think this is superstition?" Jack Henderson spoke up, his voice defensive. "You think it's just coincidence that everything started going wrong after the cursed child was born? I think bad things happen to good people all the time, and looking for someone to blame is easier than accepting that sometimes life is just hard and unfair," Marcus said. "But even if I believed in your curse, which I don't, the answer wouldn't be hurting a baby who never did anything wrong." Elder Hutchins' expression was growing darker by the moment. "Your interference in this matter will not be forgotten, Mr. Webb. The council has a long memory, and our reach extends further than you might think." "Is that a threat?" Marcus asked, and now there was no mistaking the danger in his voice. "It's a fact. We have allies throughout these mountains, people who understand the importance of protecting the community from corruption and evil influences. Your protection of this cursed child will not go unnoticed or unpunished." Marcus took a step forward, and something in his movement made all 4 men from the council take an involuntary step back. "Let me make something very clear," Marcus said. "Sarah Morgan and her daughter are under my protection. Anyone who tries to harm them, anyone who even threatens them, will answer to me personally. And trust me, that's not a conversation you want to have. Elder Hutchins stared at Marcus for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if this was a bluff or a promise. Whatever he saw in Marcus's face seemed to convince him that it was the latter. "This isn't over," Elder Hutchins said finally. "The curse must be dealt with, one way or another. If you stand in our way, you'll suffer the consequences along with everyone else." "I'll take that chance," Marcus said calmly. Elder Hutchins turned and walked back to his sedan, followed by the other 3 men. They got into the car without another word, and Elder Hutchins started the engine with perhaps more force than necessary. As they drove away, kicking up dust and gravel, Sarah could see Elder Hutchins watching her through the passenger window, his expression promising that this confrontation was far from over. Sarah stood in the doorway holding Emma, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and relief and terror all mixed together. When the sedan disappeared down the mountain road, Marcus walked over to where she was standing. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "I think so," Sarah said, though her voice was still unsteady. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up when you did. I was checking the trail markers about a mile from here when I heard the car. I figured any vehicle that wasn't mine probably meant trouble for you." Marcus looked down the road where the sedan had disappeared. "Those men, they were serious about what they said. They really believe your daughter is cursed. They think Emma is responsible for everything bad that happens in their community," Sarah said, feeling tears starting to gather. "They're never going to leave us alone. They're never going to stop believing that she's dangerous." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Maybe not," he said finally. "But believing something and acting on it are 2 different things. And after today, they know that acting on it is going to be a lot more complicated than they thought." Sarah looked at this man who had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, who had faced down 4 men and their threats as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed her. "They threatened you too," she pointed out. "Elder Hutchins said the council has a long reach. I don't want you to get in trouble because of us." "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've lived in these mountains my whole life. I know every family, every feud, every alliance, for 50 miles in any direction. The Council of Elders has influence, but they're not the only power around here, and they've never tangled with the Webb family before." "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I mean, my family has been in these mountains since before the Council existed. We've got friends and allies they've never heard of, and we know things about their precious community leaders that they'd prefer to keep quiet. If they want to make this a war, they should understand that it's one they can't win." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope mixed with her fear. "So you think they'll back down?" "I think they'll be more careful about how they approach this problem. But no, I don't think they'll back down completely. They're too invested in their beliefs and too afraid of losing face in front of their community." Marcus looked at Sarah seriously. "Which means you and Emma need to be prepared for the possibility that this isn't over." Sarah bounced Emma gently as the baby started to fuss, responding to the lingering tension in the air. "What do? We make sure you're prepared. Self-defense training. Better security for the cabin. Emergency plans in case they try something like this again." Marcus paused. "And we make sure you're not alone when they do." "You can't watch over us all the time," Sarah protested. "You have your own life, your own work. I can watch over you more than you think," Marcus said. "And you're wrong about something else too." "What?" "You said I have my own life. But the truth is, I don't have much of a life at all. I live alone, I work alone, and most days I don't talk to another human being. Having you and Emma here has been—" He trailed off, as if he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "Has been what?" Marcus looked out at the forest that surrounded them, then back at Sarah and Emma. "Has been the best thing that's happened to me in a long time," he said simply. "So protecting you isn't a burden, Sarah. It's a privilege." As they stood there in the mountain sunshine, with the threat of Elder Hutchins and the council hanging over them like a storm cloud, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't just gratitude anymore, or even relief at being protected. It was something warmer and more dangerous, something that made her heart beat faster when Marcus looked at her with those steady, determined eyes. She was falling in love with the man who had sworn to protect her daughter, and she had no idea if that was going to make their situation better or infinitely more complicated. The attacks began 3 weeks after Elder Hutchins's visit, but they were subtle at first. The kind of harassment that could be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck if you didn't know what to look for. It started with Sarah's mail being tampered with. letters torn open and resealed, packages damaged in transit. Then her credit card was mysteriously cancelled, forcing her to drive down to Pine Ridge to sort out what the bank claimed was a routine security review, but which had clearly been triggered by someone making inquiries about her account. The real message came when Sarah returned from town to find that someone had been in the cabin while she was away. Nothing was taken, but things had been moved just enough to let her know that her sanctuary had been violated. Emma's clothes had been rearranged in the dresser, books had been shifted on their shelves. The coffee can where Sarah kept her emergency money had been opened, and the bills counted, then placed back exactly where it had been, but with the 20s on top instead of the 5s. A detail that made Sarah's blood run cold. Marcus arrived within an hour of her panicked phone call, bringing with him a grim expression and a toolbox full of security equipment. He spent the rest of the afternoon installing deadbolts on all the doors, securing the windows with pins that would make them impossible to open from outside, and setting up a motion-activated camera system that would record anyone approaching the cabin. "They're testing you," he explained as he worked, "seeing how far they can push before you break and run. It's psychological warfare, meant to make you feel helpless and isolated." "It's working," Sarah admitted, bouncing Emma nervously as she watched Marcus install a sensor on the back door. "I keep jumping at every sound. I can't sleep. I feel like we're under siege." Marcus paused in his work and looked at her with sympathy. "I know it's scary, but this is actually good news in a way." "How is any of this good news?" "Because it means they're not confident enough to try a direct assault. If they thought they could just take Emma by force, they would have done it already. Instead, they're trying to wear you down psychologically, which means they're still worried about the consequences of more direct action." Sarah wanted to be comforted by this analysis, but the constant fear was wearing on her nerves and affecting her ability to care for Emma properly. The baby was picking up on her mother's anxiety and becoming fussy and difficult, crying at odd hours and refusing to settle into the peaceful routines they had established. "What if they escalate?" Sarah asked. "What if this psychological pressure doesn't work and they decide to try something more direct?" "Then we'll be ready for them," Marcus said firmly. "But in the meantime, we need to make sure you're prepared to defend yourself if something happens when I'm not here." The next day, Marcus began teaching Sarah basic self-defense and firearm safety. She had never held a gun before, and her first attempts to load and fire the small revolver Marcus brought were clumsy and nerve-wracking. But fear was a powerful motivator, and she learned quickly. Within a week, she could load, aim, and fire with reasonable accuracy, and more importantly, she had lost her fear of the weapon itself. "I don't want to have to shoot anyone," Sarah said after a particularly intense practice session. "Even if they're trying to hurt Emma, the idea of actually pulling the trigger—" "I hope you never have to," Marcus replied. "But if it comes down to protecting your daughter, you'll find the strength to do what's necessary. The maternal instinct is stronger than you think." As if responding to their conversation, Emma began to cry from inside the cabin where she had been napping. Sarah hurried to check on her, but found that the baby had simply gotten her leg caught between the slats of her crib and couldn't free herself. As Sarah lifted Emma out and soothed her, she noticed that the baby's affected leg seemed to be bothering her more than usual. Emma whimpered when Sarah tried to straighten it, and the foot appeared more twisted than it had been just a few weeks ago. "Is something wrong?" Marcus asked, noticing Sarah's concerned expression. "I think Emma's leg is getting worse," Sarah said, holding the baby so Marcus could see. "The doctor back home said she might need surgery as she got older, but I thought we had more time." Marcus examined Emma's leg gently, his expression growing serious. "This definitely looks like it's getting more pronounced. Have you been able to take her for medical checkups since you've been here?"
Sarah shook her head.
"I can't afford it. And I'm afraid that if I take her to a doctor, they'll ask questions about where we came from and why we're here. What if word gets back to Elder Hutchins that we're still in the area?" "Emma's health is more important than staying hidden," Marcus said firmly. "There's a doctor down in Millerville, about 40 miles south of here. She's a woman named Dr. Patricia Santos, and she specializes in pediatric orthopedics. More importantly, she's someone who can be trusted to keep patient information confidential." "How do you know her?" Marcus hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "She treated my sister when we were kids. She was the one who told my parents that Kelly's cleft palate could be fixed with surgery, and she helped arrange for it to be done at a reduced cost when my family couldn't afford the full price." He looked at Emma, who was now calm and alert in Sarah's arms. "Dr. Santos believes that every child deserves the chance to be healthy, regardless of their family's circumstances." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. "Do you think she would see Emma?" "I think she would see Emma, and I think she would work with us on payment arrangements. The question is whether you're willing to take the risk of leaving the mountain to get Emma the care she needs. It was a difficult decision. Staying hidden felt safer in the short term, but Sarah could see that Emma's condition was definitely worsening. The baby was having more trouble moving her leg, and she seemed to be experiencing discomfort even during normal activities like diaper changes and baths. "Let's call her," Sarah said finally. "If she's willing to see Emma and keep it confidential, then we'll make the trip." Dr. Santos was indeed willing to see Emma, and she scheduled an appointment for the following week. Sarah spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation, torn between hope that something could be done to help her daughter and fear that leaving their mountain refuge would expose them to new dangers. The night before the appointment, Marcus came to the cabin with a proposal that surprised Sarah completely. "I want to go with you to the doctor," he said, without preamble. Sarah blinked in surprise. "You don't need to do that. I can manage. I'm sure you can. But I want to be there anyway, for support, for protection, and because." Marcus trailed off, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "Because what?" Marcus looked at Emma, who was playing on a blanket on the floor, reaching for colorful blocks that Sarah had made from scraps of fabric. "'Cause I care about what happens to both of you, more than I probably should." Sarah felt her heart start to beat faster. Over the past 2 months, she had been increasingly aware of her growing feelings for Marcus, but she had convinced herself that those feelings were one-sided, born from gratitude and the intensity of their situation, rather than any real mutual attraction. "Marcus," she started to say, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know this is complicated," he said. "You're dealing with serious problems. You're trying to protect your daughter, and the last thing you need is me making the situation more emotionally complex. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just about helping a neighbor in distress." Sarah felt tears starting to gather in her eyes, but they were tears of relief and happiness rather than sadness or fear. "I was starting to think I was imagining things," she said softly. "You weren't imagining anything. But I also don't want you to feel pressured or obligated because I've been helping you. If you don't feel the same way, I do," Sarah said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. "I do feel the same way." "But you're right that it's complicated. I have Emma to think about, and she has to come first in every decision I make." Marcus moved closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Emma does come first," he said. "For both of us. But that doesn't mean there can't be room for other feelings too." He reached out and touched Sarah's cheek gently, and she leaned into the contact with a relief that surprised her. She hadn't realized how much she had been craving human touch, the simple comfort of being cared for by someone other than the baby she was responsible for protecting. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "Being with me means being in danger from the council. It means taking on responsibility for a child who isn't yours. It means dealing with all the complications that come with Emma's medical condition." "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've already taken on the danger from the council. I'm already responsible for Emma's safety because I care about both of you. And as for her medical condition, that's not a complication. It's just part of who she is, and who she is perfect." Sarah felt something inside her chest that had been tightly wound for months finally begin to relax. For the first time since Thomas had died, she felt like she might not have to face the future completely alone. "Okay," she said. "Come with us to the doctor, and after that, we'll figure out what comes next." Marcus smiled, the first truly relaxed, happy expression Sarah had seen on his face since they met. "After that," he said, "we'll figure it out together." The trip to Dr. Santos went better than Sarah had dared to hope. The doctor was a warm, competent woman in her 50s who examined Emma with gentle thoroughness and spoke to Sarah as an equal rather than lecturing her about what she should have done differently. The news was mixed, but not devastating. Emma's condition was indeed worsening, but it was still very treatable with surgery. The procedure would need to be done within the next year, ideally sooner rather than later, and it would require several follow-up appointments and physical therapy sessions. "The good news," Dr. Santos explained, "is that with proper treatment, Emma should be able to walk normally. She'll probably always have some limitations in terms of running and jumping, but she should be able to live a completely normal, active life." The financial discussion was more challenging. Even with Dr. Santos's willingness to work with them on payment arrangements, the surgery and follow-up care would cost several $1,000s that Sarah didn't have. But for the first time since Emma was born, Sarah had hoped that her daughter's future would be limited by money rather than by people's ignorance and superstition. On the drive back up the mountain, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her car seat, and Marcus was driving with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew every curve and pothole on the winding road. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the trees in golden shafts that made the whole forest look magical. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly. Marcus glanced at her. "For what?" "For everything. For giving us a place to live. For protecting us from Elder Hutchins. For coming with us to the doctor today. For making me feel like we're not completely alone in the world." "You don't need to thank me for any of that," Marcus said. "Taking care of people you love isn't something you deserve thanks for. It's just what you do." The casual use of the word love sent a warm flush through Sarah's chest. It was too early for such declarations, too soon to be sure of feelings that had developed under such intense and unusual circumstances. But it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in a very long time. They were about 5 miles from the cabin when Marcus suddenly slowed the truck and pulled over to the shoulder. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, following his gaze up the road ahead. Through the trees they could see smoke rising into the evening sky. Not the grey smoke of a controlled burn or a campfire, but the thick black smoke that meant something significant was burning. "That's coming from the direction of the cabin," Marcus said grimly, reaching for his cell phone. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You don't think—" "I don't know," Marcus said, dialing a number. "But we're going to find out." The call was to someone Marcus identified only as Tom, and the conversation was brief and urgent. When Marcus hung up, his expression was grim. "Tom's a neighbor who lives about 3 miles from here. He says there were cars on the mountain road this afternoon, people he didn't recognize. And he can see flames from his place." Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. "We need to get back there. All my things, Emma's things, we need to be careful," Marcus corrected. "If this is the council's doing, and I'm pretty sure it is, then they might still be up there waiting for us to come back." Sarah felt tears starting to stream down her face. After everything they had been through, after finally finding safety and hope, the people who had driven her from her first home had now destroyed her second. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Marcus started the truck and began driving slowly up the mountain road, his eyes scanning the forest around them for any sign of movement or danger. "We're going to find out exactly what happened," he said. "And then we're going to make sure it never happens again." The determination in his voice was so fierce that Sarah almost felt sorry for Elder Hutchins and his council. Almost. The cabin was gone. Not damaged, not partially burned, but completely destroyed. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, where her sanctuary had been just hours earlier, staring at the smoking pile of ash and charred wood that represented everything she and Emma had called home. The stone fireplace stood like a tombstone in the middle of the destruction, its chimney pointing accusingly at the darkening sky. Marcus moved carefully around the perimeter of the burned area, examining the ground for signs of how the fire had started. Sarah could see him taking pictures with his phone and collecting what looked like evidence in plastic bags he had brought from his truck. His movements were methodical and professional, and Sarah realized that this wasn't the first time he had investigated a suspicious fire. "It was definitely arson," Marcus said when he returned to where Sarah was standing with Emma in her arms. "I can see at least 3 separate points where accelerant was used to start the fires. This wasn't an accident or someone dropping a cigarette. This was planned and executed by people who knew what they were doing." Sarah felt numb. All of Emma's things, the few possessions she had managed to save from her old life, the small comforts that had made the cabin feel like home, all of it was gone. "How do we prove that the council did this?" "We don't need to prove it," Marcus said grimly. "We know they did it, and more importantly, they know we know. This was a message, not a secret operation. They wanted us to understand that they can reach us anywhere, that nowhere is safe as long as Emma is with you." Sarah felt tears starting again, but they were angry tears now rather than defeated ones. "So what do we do? Keep running? Find another place to hide until they burn that down too?" Marcus looked at the destruction around them, then at Sarah and Emma. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but filled with determination. "No, we stop running. We stop hiding. We make them face the consequences of what they've done." "What do you mean?" "I mean it's time to fight back. But first, we need to get you and Emma somewhere safe, while we figure out our next move." Marcus led them back to his truck and drove deeper into the mountains, following roads that got progressively narrower and more primitive, until they were basically just tracks through the forest. Sarah had never been this far from civilization, and the isolation was both frightening and oddly comforting. If she couldn't find this place, then neither could Elder Hutchins and his followers. They finally stopped at another cabin, this one smaller and more rustic than the one that had been destroyed. It was built into a natural clearing on a ridge that offered views of the surrounding valleys, and Sarah could see why Marcus's family had chosen this spot. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they could reach the cabin. "This was my grandfather's hunting lodge," Marcus explained as he helped Sarah carry Emma inside. "It's not as comfortable as the other place, but it's much more defensible, and very few people know it exists." The cabin was indeed more primitive, with no electricity and only a hand-pumped well for water. But it was clean and dry, and the stone fireplace would provide heat for cooking and warmth. More importantly, Sarah could see that Marcus had prepared for this possibility. There were supplies already stored in the cabin, enough food and water to last for weeks if necessary.
You planned for this, Sarah said.
It wasn't a question. I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but yes, I planned for the possibility that they would escalate their harassment into outright violence. Marcus began lighting oil lamps to push back the gathering darkness. "I've been preparing for a war with the Council since the day they first threatened you." "What kind of preparation?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell her. "I've been gathering information about Elder Hutchins and the other council members. Financial records, personal histories, evidence of other times they've used intimidation and violence to get their way. I've also been reaching out to allies, people who have their own grievances against the Council's methods." Sarah felt a flicker of hope mixed with her fear. What kind of allies? Families who've been forced out of their communities for not conforming to the Council's interpretation of proper behavior. People who've been financially ruined by the Council's business dealings. Law enforcement officials who are tired of the Council operating like they're above the law. Marcus sat down across from Sarah, his expression serious. "The Council has made a lot of enemies over the years, Sarah. They've just been careful to keep those enemies isolated and afraid to fight back. But if we can bring them together, you're talking about starting some kind of uprising against them. I'm talking about using legal channels and community pressure to hold them accountable for their actions. The arson tonight was a mistake on their part. It was the kind of obvious criminal activity that even their allies in law enforcement can't ignore." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. The baby had no idea that her entire world had just been destroyed again, that the people who were supposed to protect children were instead trying to harm her because of something she couldn't control. "What if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked. "What if the legal system doesn't care, or what if the Council has too much influence to be stopped?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Then we disappear. All three of us. We take Emma somewhere far away where the Council can't reach us, and we start over completely. All three of us?" "If you'll have me," Marcus said simply. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Sarah, but I am asking you to let me be part of Emma's life, part of your life, whatever form that takes. Whether we stay here and fight or leave and start over somewhere else." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You would really leave everything behind for us? Your family land, your business, your whole life here?" "My life here doesn't mean anything without you and Emma in it," Marcus said. "I've spent the last 30 years living alone in these mountains.